So the goal of using the error interceptor and doing the work up front to handle all of these is to make this as easy as possible in our application as we develop it, so we don't really need to worry about errors. And this is not quite perfect. This is not quite what I'm looking for. We don't want to have to loop over an array of arrays. We just want to loop over the flat validation errors that we get back from this. So what we can do, if we go back to our error interceptor, and supposing you've been keeping up to date with the, as I'm sure you have, the latest JavaScript features, then you'll be aware that what we can do if we have an array of arrays, then we can flatten them using the flat method. So we can take our model state errors and we can say flat. And here's where we find a bit of disappointment. I know this method exists. It was released in ES 2019, and yet the property flat does not exist on any, well, this is an array of anything. But I mentioned earlier that TypeScript's wonderful, and we can use all the modern features of JavaScript inside TypeScript because it compiles it into something our browsers can understand. So why can't we use this? Well, let's take a look at the reason for that. And if we take a look in our folder, and we take a look in the tsconfig.json file. Now, Angular are messing around with these files at the moment. They did introduce a bug in a slightly earlier version of Angular 10, which they've resolved by putting things back to normal, and we can get our tsconfig inside this file. But what we're looking for is this lib area. Now, we've got ES 2018, but there is a newer version of ECMAScript or JavaScript, and that's ES 2019. So what we can do is specify ES 2019 in here, add a comma, and we will need to restart our application here. So let's go ahead and do that because we're getting our error saying that this doesn't exist. But if we restart our application now, then what we should find is that error goes away because now we've got access to JavaScript from 2019, which does include that new method that allows us to flatten arrays. And great, our application's restarted. So let's go back to the error interceptor. And now we can see that we do have this flat method available. And it returns a new array with all subarray elements concatenated into it recursively up to the specified depth. So if we go and take a look at our browser once again, and let's once again, well, let's just refresh the page just to make sure we have just restarted our server, and let's click on the test validation error, and now what we see is a very simple to use array of the validation error messages. Perfect. So what we want to do with validation errors is when we click on this, we want to display this on the browser page itself. This is typically going to be from a form validation error. Now we will be introducing client-side validation anyway, but so look, we can display server-side validation errors because maybe we've been a bit more strict on something on the server than we have on the client. That's not a great way to go about things, but just in case. And there are certain validation types of errors, although we're not surfacing it as a validation error, such as the username is already in use. We wouldn't be able to identify that from the client side unless we were using, well, we'd still, whatever we have to do, we have to go and check with the server to see if a username's already in use. But what we want to do is get these errors and display them on the page. So what we'll do, we'll go back to VS Code and we'll open up our test errors component once again. And what we'll do inside here is we'll add a property, a class property, and we'll call it validation errors. And we know what type this is going to be. It's going to be a string array. So we can actually specify that inside here. And then what we can do, we can go down to our validation error, and where we've got the error, we know what we're throwing back into our response here. So underneath the console.log, we can say list.validationErrors equals error. And then we can go to our test errors template. So we'll open up the test errors template component, and underneath the buttons, what we'll do is we'll just add a div and we'll give it some space from the buttons. So we'll just call it a row and margin top MT-5. And what we'll do is we'll add a conditional and we'll say a-ng if, and we've initialized our validation errors to, although we haven't initialized this at all, but let's initialize this to an empty array. And what we can do then inside our expression here for the ng if statement, we can check to see if the validation errors.length is greater than 0. And if it is, what we'll do is we'll add an unordered list and give it a class of text-danger. And inside here we can just add our list items. And inside the list item we can add an ng4, so we'll say a-ng4, and we can say let error of validation errors. And inside the list item we can simply use interpolation and display the error. So let's take a look and see if this is the desired effect we're looking for. So we'll go back to our browser, and if we click on the test validation error, then we can see the errors that we get and displayed on our browser. And it's nice and easy to use because they're now flattened into an array. Perfect. What we'll take a look at next is handling the 404 not found.